into the science of the soil, of the ecology, looking at techniques. So I feel very technical, very hands-on, a little bit academic towards the hard science side. And now I want to take a step and start looking at things from the community well-being. Contrary to popular belief, where folks would say, like, this is not an area where science exists. It's actually an area where science does exist. We can study these things, and although you won't hear me mention it very often, my formal background is actually in the social sciences, human sciences. I study positive developmental psychology, and I have a focus on cross-cultural understandings of human goodness and values, and like how to build community. And so that kind of work is relevant in what we're doing. I'm not going to give a presentation that's very science heavy, but if you have kind of more questions, we can get into it, and I am going to introduce a few psychological concepts as we talk about some of these things. But the main thing is just to remember that this is a really important area of what we're doing, and to really highlight it and do work in this area as well. So we're going to jump in. This is a presentation on community well-being, kind of focused on striving for health in the context of community composting. What is the essence of community composting, right? We're looking at the soil, and we're looking at people. We're looking at both of them as wholes, and we're also looking at how do they interact when they come together. So when we talk about soil, I think it's kind of analogous to kind of thinking about like all things that are related to the environment around us, the natural world, life that's non-human. And then when we look at people, we can think of people in terms of individual well-being and like the integration that happens within a single individual, and we can also think about relationships and communities. I think, unfortunately, in our kind of dominant culture right now, we have a lens that like really zeroes in only on the individual, and doesn't emphasize as much the aspects of people that are relational or community-based. So we're going to go into that a little bit more. And then, of course, even less than relations between human beings is the relations between human beings and the environment and how we can be integrated. And that's really part of the focus of community composting, is how do we bring ourselves back into harmony with nature and the people who live in that nature, and how do we stay in harmonious relationship with each other and with the land. That's what's really sustainable for us as human beings. And I think we're all kind of aware that we have maybe departed a little bit from that trajectory, and we're I guess part of the movement of maybe that course correct back to those things. So unfortunately, in a lot of movement building around environmental themes, we forget about the people part. We forget that we are not having these environmental problems because they're just sort of happening. We're having them because of the way human beings are developing built environment and engaging in the utilization of resource in ways that has been pretty unprecedented in the history of our presence on the planet. We, as human beings, have both kind of two ways of adapting to the environment. We adapt as other animals do through like evolutionary mechanisms. We learn how to be in spaces, and we like our bodies change in relation to those spaces over many years. Similar as what happens with other animals, but we also have culture, we have language, we have tools, we have practices, which we pass down from generation to generation, and we pass among groups of people. And this is the people part. So human beings relative to other animals, mammals, were actually born quite prematurely, and that's in terms of our brain development. And that but partially related to the fact that you got to fit a big head out of a body, and it's got to come at a certain time or it's not going to come out. But the other really unique thing that happens because of that is much more of our brain development happens in interaction with the environment. And our body and brain are actually expecting certain kinds of social experience, and that's hardwiring the way that we interact. And so we go into groups neglecting the people part often because we're supposed to already know how to do that. We're not supposed to not know how to do that. And we all know how to interact with people, but it's actually informed by our prior experiences. So when we have prior experiences of family trauma, of community trauma, then our brains get programmed for relating to humans in ways that are because of adverse circumstances. And what that leads to is certain kinds of behaviors that don't necessarily lead to healthy community interactions. They're good at dealing with crises, but maybe not so good at building up harmony again. And so when we just move on our prior experience, we leave ourselves vulnerable to just playing out things that might actually not be serving the goals of where we want to go. So we may be repeating things that are actually part of what we want to transform. And so when we kind of call this into our awareness, that gives us an opportunity to move from intentionality and start imagining the world we want to build and really playing things out. Like, oh, is that really going to get us there? Or is that going to get us the same but in a slightly different package? Another reason why we often neglect the people part is like we just don't want to take the time to do the people part. It takes time to resolve conflict. It takes time to build community agreements. And we are in a dominant paradigm that keeps us going, keeps us under stress so that we feel like we don't have time for these kinds of things. And the more we feel like we don't have time for community, the more we are in this system that tells us you gotta work, you gotta have money because you don't have any friends to take care of you when you're sick, so you better have money so you can buy food. Whereas actually, if we can slow down and build solid relationships, we actually don't need as much money. We don't have to worry about I'm going to be homeless or I'm going to starve because I know I can go crash at your place if I suddenly find myself, unable to pay my rent. And that's the resiliency of community that we as human beings have evolved over 200,000 years to have, and only in this last era, and this actually really last super short era of like industrial capitalism, that we are just like going, abstracting things that we never abstracted before, like large numbers, social structures where we aren't interacting with the people that we're working together with. This is coming back from that. We are being mindful of the big systems that we've created, but at the same time, we're working together face to face. We're kind of igniting these like beautiful and small ways of being that actually our brains are more hardwired to engage with. And last thing is we often neglect this because we don't even realize how much people part there is to doing anything. In large groups of people. I personally think that that's also a relic of modern society, in particular, an undervaluing of the work that women do, a really ignoring of things that have been traditionally relegated to gender-based roles. And so I think by also acknowledging how much people care there is and valuing the care and the nurturing that goes into this work is a way of kind of elevating positive femininity, and especially when we hold space for everybody to do that and really show that these are things that are really part of being an integrated and whole human being, and they're part of healthy cultures regardless of whether we carry those out in gender roles or not. My opinion, and I think you'll find as you do this work, is it's really important to give attention to this element. And if we don't give our attention, if we don't make a point of doing some of this work, there are other things that will demand our attention. And as human beings, we actually have a limited ability to process information. We can only really hold, 7 plus or minus 2 things in mind at a time. So we can toggle back and forth between things, but we cannot hold everything. That is like a cognitive carrying capacity of our organism, that we have limited attention. And because of that, we have evolutionary mechanisms in our brain that help us to prioritize things. And so when we feel stress, when we feel something is urgent, when we see a no, those things take precedent over other things. And when you're constantly in a system that tells you, like, if you don't do this, you're not going to have, or you're going to lose this opportunity, or here's this beautiful shiny thing, better come get it right now or it's gone, which is all of the messaging that's around us all the time is putting us in that place, then it's really hard for us to put weight on the things that are more gentle, that take more time, setting aside time for dialogues and community building, intention setting. And so this is a place where we have to understand if we do nothing in the system now, we will keep go, and we will not put time on this. But once we know that, we have systems in our neocortex that allow us to say, I know what's happening, and I know that I feel stressed about that, but I'm going to regulate this stress, or I'm going to ask someone to help me co-regulate so that we will still do this. And so we have the capacity to imagine what will happen if we just keep going, and to make a different choice. And so when we're doing soil work and we're experiencing a lot of urgency, we also have the opportunity to schedule and agree to do some of this more long-term community development. I wanted to share about a recent project with LA Compost, which was called the Accelerating Resilience Los Angeles Project. And we actually had the opportunity to work with communities on this kind of vision that emerged from their work, which was the work of reclaiming the true story of environmental health, human wholeness, and community empowerment. And so this was kind of integrating across the environmental dimension, this kind of personal dimension, and this community dimension in this vision. And I just wanted to share this with you and just dive into a little bit of just dialogue, get you guys involved in what I'm saying. Just kind of throw it out there. Feel free to raise your hand. What does human wholeness mean to you? What would you do if you heard something like that coming around you? What does that make you feel? How do you experience feeling whole? Let's just explore this idea a little bit together.
When I get to both give and receive.
When you get to both give and receive.
In the same setting, in the same relationship.
In the same setting, in the same relationship. Beautiful. That's when you experience feeling whole. Anyone else want to share, willing to share when they experience wholeness?
When others accept me as I am, not expecting anything.
When people answer you as you are, not expecting anything.
No, it's I don't know, I accept people as they are, but they don't expect them to be a certain way because that pleases me.
So you don't expect them to be a certain way? They're not trying to people please you. They're just coming as they are, and you're also able to come as you are. Beautiful.
When I work for nature rather than myself.
When you work for nature rather than yourself. Beautiful.
I sit with my experience and also in relation to nature and that of my ancestors.
When you sit with your own experience, also in nature, in relation to nature, and in relation to the past people who come before you, your ancestors. Beautiful, thank you.
When the mind, body, and spirit are present.
When mind, body, and spirit are present, you feel whole. Beautiful, thank you for sharing. Evelyn.
Collective consciousness. It's a cellular activity where everybody plays their own role.
So you experience wholeness when you're kind of having an experience of collective consciousness and just kind of feeling like everything's in place in its own role? Thank you.
When I experience connection and belonging.
The experience of connection and belonging help you to feel whole? Thank you. Zro.
Yeah, when I'm meeting my needs consistently.
When you're meeting your needs consistently.
Yeah, so I can show up as my best self in spaces of collective.
So you can show up as your best self in the spaces of collective, then you feel whole. Beautiful. Thank you. Also just want to explore with y'all a little bit the idea of community empowerment. What does community empowerment mean to you? When do you most fully experience empowerment as a community or in community?
I think community empowerment is being able to create an environment where everything everybody just said is happening.
So being able to create an environment where the kinds of things that people just said are happening. that is an empowering community environment.
When needs are met for the community, less harm, the least amount of harm, and the ability for full creative expression.
When the needs of the community are met with the least amount of harm to the environment, the least amount of harm, period, to anything at all, and when there's opportunity for creative experience. Is that what you said?
Full creative expression.
Full creative expression. Sorry, I got distracted or something. Mira.
When we can connect through collective work towards a shared vision.
Connecting through collective work towards shared vision. That's when you experience community empowerment. Beautiful. Thank you, Evelyn.
When differences are celebrated.
When differences are celebrated. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Oliver.
Working as one.
So Oliver said working as one.
Creating environments where self-advocacy is encouraged and can happen, and also supporting that self-advocacy.
So creating environments where self-advocacy can happen and supporting that self-advocacy, I guess, of the members of the community. Thank you.
Community
Community level accountability for everything that affects everyone in the community and outside the community, I guess. Thank you. And Beck.
I feel like when you could come into a reflective space to where everybody could share what they've been sort of impacted or affected by, and then we also learn the different ways that the work can impact others.
So kind of moving in a reflective space, being able to hear the impacts of things on others and the knowledge or solutions that people are bringing. Kind of like maybe a harnessing of collective wisdom and a little bit of space for dropping into reflection.
Practicing stewardship in a collective space.
Practicing stewardship in a collective space. Thank you. I mean, a lot of wisdom in the room. I think when we take a moment to think about it, we have a lot to offer in these areas. So thank you for sharing. When we drop into this reflective space, I think we can start to really distill the principles that work. I think probably everyone in this room does have a lot of experience working with communities and seeing what kind of works and what doesn't. So having done low-key, processing experimentation just by oh yeah, that didn't work, or whenever I see that happening, it seems like we get this kind of I don't know, shame and blame culture instead of affirm and acknowledge culture, and kind of realizing what really works to build long-term healthy relationships. In this next part, I want to take a little bit of time to share some psychological organizing principles for well-being. Not because I think that those particular theories are something that we couldn't figure out on our own, but just nice when someone lays something out concisely in a way that's easy to follow along. So a lot of times we're working in spaces where transformation needs to happen, and sometimes there's overwhelm, there's difficulty, and we are trying to encourage people to go on this journey with us, and sometimes it's really hard, it's really burdensome, and one of the things that lightens that load of the burden that we need to lift as we're doing the heavy lift of social transformation is hope. So in the psychological research on hope, they break hope down into 3 parts. One, when you have these 3 parts, then you have hope. And if you're missing one of those, you start losing hope. And I find this very helpful because sometimes when folks are feeling demoralized, you can kind of quickly go, oh, we're missing this one, and you can zero in on where to focus your attention to kind of get the energy back in your group and get everyone back on the same page. So what optimism is really kind of this vision, what are we working for, and it's positive, right? So we want to get that clear. If folks don't really see where they're going or what we're building or what we're working for, and we're going through a challenge, we're not feeling good about it. But if we can see it, we're willing to walk through difficulty to get there. The second is what these researchers, this is the work of Lopez and Snyder in the kind of academic way, but they lay out this work. And the second thing that they identify is pathway. So if you're trying to get somewhere, if you're trying to achieve something, if you're trying to bring something into being, you want a clear idea of how we get from where we are today to that future spot that we envision. And if you don't see how you can get from point A to point B, that can be demoralizing, and that makes people give up. And that's a place where you can like hunker down with strategies and start like figuring it out, what might work, kind of brainstorm sessions, or like evaluate your resources, etc. That's really the how. How is this going to happen? How is it going to happen in terms of what's the plan? How is it going to happen in terms of what are the agreements we have between each other as a collective or as a group or as partners making this happen? Who's going to do what, and how is it going to happen? Is that clear in our mind? And the last, these researchers characterize it as agency. This is the feeling that like in order to make that thing that we hope for happen, that I or we have the capacity to do it. Like we can actually do this. If you have a beautiful vision and a beautiful pathway, but like you don't have the resources or the collective capacity to do that strategy, you're not going to be feeling very good about it. So it has, what you're going to do on the pathway has to be something that you feel empowered to do in order to have this feeling of inspiration and hope to move forward. So I just wanted to break that down, share that with y'all. If it's a helpful framework, I know sometimes it's helped me when I've been a little bit reflecting on like just people aren't feeling this, like where can we work, and it's been pretty effective. Also, you can share with people themselves so that you can be like formal about it or informal about it. Just say like, hey, can you contribute on one of these areas where you think we're like maybe struggling right now? And that's a way that like people can kind of take charge of that little element in their own consciousness, and we can share that knowledge. Another, this in psychology, this is like a really, really, really big theory, super well validated and all that, but it's actually one that's very like resonant. It really works, and that's why it's there. This is the work of Richard Ryan and Edward Deci, and like hundreds and hundreds of other people have done studies in this area. Anyway, so what they looked at is kind of an overall well-being theory of like when are people really at their best. And what they determined, they kind of later maybe might have changed the name, but that ship had already sailed, so it's called self-determination theory. But what they found is people really thrive when they have three things. The three things that were originally identified were autonomy, relatedness, and competence. When people are feeling these three things, they pretty much behave in an almost like invincible way. Like they are confident, they are healthy. You see all kinds of downstream health effects on like your physiology, on your ability to follow through with your goals, like all kinds of things. So these three have been identified as really, really core. Later on, another researcher was like, this doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover everything. You know, there's something more. And he was like, people really just want to contribute to the well-being of others. Like people literally just want to be good. That was kind of what he was putting forward. And they were like, nah, we don't really think so. And he's like, I'm going to prove it to you. So he ran a bunch of also complex experiments and kind of showed that there is a completely independent contribution of something else. He called it benevolence, to this model of human well-being, that even when you have very high autonomy, very high relatedness, very high competence, you will be having even better outcomes in terms of your own health and well-being and the health of the people around you if you're also kind of contributing in a rather benevolent way. And so kind of breaking these out of like a little bit of academic language, when we really recognize everyone's capacity to make their own choices and their individuality and their ability to act on that, that's sort of like the experience of autonomy. And when we really recognize that people are in relationship and people are interdependent, and that this is part of like how we are as human beings, and we support that, that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about relatedness. I think competence is maybe the least accessible. This is really like not only the ability to do things and affect change on the world and actually having that capacity, but also the feeling of having that capacity. So that feeling of empowerment, that's kind of coming here on this dimension. And the last one we were just talking about, benevolence, is kind of this idea that we want to make positive contribution. And so when we're talking about community well-being, when we're talking about engaging in communities, this is something you look at for yourself to make sure, like, if you're not kind of happy with where things are, to just check in and be like, am I kind of fulfilling these needs? That's how they structure these things, is that these are actually fundamental human needs. We have a need for autonomy, we have a need for relatedness, we have a need for competence, and we have a need for this kind of contribution. And if we don't meet those needs, we're actually not well. And so this is a framework that you can check in on with yourself, and then also with the people around you. And when you're building structures to support the development of the people around you, you know, we are often in hierarchical relation. Like, is that providing enough autonomy to the people on both sides of that? If not, how can we improve that dimension? How is it impacting, like, our ability to relate? Is someone very isolated in the work that they're doing? Is there a way that we can structure things? Yeah, we can be really efficient and send 2 community composters on 2 different runs and, like, have them doing heavy lifts, but we can also send them together to do those same heavy lifts, and they'll go more places together, they'll engage with more communities, but your long-term sustainability of that program is going to be more, because you're not going to burn those individuals out. They're able to relate to each other, and be getting help, etc. In terms of competence, are we really building the skills? Are we training and walking alongside before expecting results from others? Are we really building confidence in the people that we're working with? And are we doing that, allowing other people to do that for us as we're in relation to them? And are we making these positive contributions? Are we centering that? Are we open about that in our language? Or do we fall into, like, oh, everybody wants to hear about money and they don't want to hear, they think that we're just, like, you know, trying to do the nonprofit, like, schmear thing. I think really dropping down into this space to realize that the desire and the need to contribute to your fellow human beings is actually very fundamentally human. And if it's fundamentally human, when we presuppose that in anyone that we're interacting with, even someone that may seem to be in a more antagonistic or adversarial role to us, we invite them to actually meet their needs in relation to what we're doing. And so they can contribute in ways that you might not have expected. If you come at them with, like, I know you want to, I know you need to, and here's an opportunity to do so. This concept is called Ubuntu. It's a South African kind of concept, is really the best word I can think for it. Different words from different languages, but this kind of understanding that I only exist because you exist, or because we exist, and because we're in community with each other. And at the same time, the flavor of that existence is really imbued with a sense of what it means to be fundamentally human, and with kindness. And for them, this is like the word or the concept that is really characterizing this fundamental humanity. And what it does that's very different from the way that our modern society interacts, but that I would encourage you to really carry out in the places that you work, is to really see people in their whole individuality and all that they bring, both strengths and weaknesses. And at the same time, you're seeing that as seeing, because of that uniqueness and that individuality, they are contributing to all of what the whole is. And so their contributions enrich the whole. Their weaknesses are also part of the whole. But each person's weakness is also something that, like, the community can support, can compensate for, can facilitate growth in. And each person's strengths are things that can help the community as a whole to grow and move forward. And so when we have this kind of dynamic integration between the individual and, like, the interdependent whole, we can kind of toggle back in this space where we have a creative, dynamic, like, responsive group that can really take up any challenge, but could also care for all the members of the group. the way I understand it and the way I put it forward is like we just need to be really, really human with each other. We need to see when people are in need and what kind of support, and we need to check in with ourselves if we have the capacity to support them. Sometimes we don't overextend ourselves in our capacity by like going asking some other people to help, or a completely different group of people, if they can step in and facilitate with that. In terms of like a psychological concepts, I just love that. I think I'm hearing it from you, this idea that we can really be integrated as a community group. But the other thing that I want to elevate is really important is like when we're dealing with soil, we're dealing with something complex. When we're dealing with human systems, we're dealing with something complex. And it's important for us to like hold the vision of the whole, even if we can't address all the parts of the whole. But when we hold a vision that's very narrow and start working, we can actually go away from what we want very easily and start behaving in ways that are maybe part of what we want to dismantle. And so we kind of have to check it within the context of a wide whole. And so I encourage you to take that vision as broad as you can take it. It may be like the world we want to live in. It may be like solutions that will actually work for everyone. Because if you find a solution that doesn't work for everyone, then you're working for something that other people are working to dismantle. And if you kind of spend the time to creatively generate that vision that everyone can be on board with, then you have no resistance to that. It's just the capacity you need to build within your group, but you don't have people within the group or people around you pulling you down or giving you that extra inertia. So it's really, really worth it to create this vision together as much as possible and to be clear about it with others. This is also really important because our minds are actually organized this way. And when you present information, when people take in information, you want to present the big picture first and then fill in the details. When you start with the details, like that leaves the person to imagine the whole you're building. And especially when you're building a whole that's different from the system that we live in, people will start going and thinking a very different idea, and they're actually not on the same page as you. And so this is a way of starting with the vision and moving to the details when you organize a community meeting, when you're talking to a coworker. These are just really, really simple ways to like help be on the same page and feel connected to each other. And the last within this area is to really work within your capacity. So oversimplification is often a way that we psychologically manage overwhelm. So we make it more simple so that it's easier for us to think about it and we don't feel stressed out about it. Not because the thing is actually simple, because it's easier for us to deal with if we believe that it is. But most things are actually quite complex. So when we work within our capacity, I think something that's important to remember is that you can grow your capacity over time. We can engage in a little bit of this like strategic discomfort of knowing that like we're striving for this thing and we don't quite have the capacity yet, but we're growing and we're getting the support that we need to do so. You can grow your capacity as an individual. You can grow your capacity as a community. Some of the best tools to really promote the growing of your capacity is to resist that negative self-talk that's like really prevalent in this culture, and resist isolation. So your capacity is very limited when you're working alone. You use only what you can do yourself, and it puts you very much into dependence on a system that relies on oppression as its means of making things happen. So when you are less isolated, when you're in community, that's when you have more capacity. You have the capacity of what we can all do together, right? I mean, this is the proof of it. I could never run 150 community gardens, right? But we all can together, and we're going to be composting all across the state. And who knows, we may, we may compost all the waste in the state. We may have no more big industrial facilities. You never know. The power of small group of people that's organizing the people around them is real, and that's growing capacity over time. So what I encourage you to do if you need to grow capacity is seek out others who will support and encourage you. You know, don't just cut everybody out, but like when you need support, go to the people who are going to give it to you. Don't go to the people who are not going to give it to you. If you are feeling down and need to be empowered, don't go to the person who's going to criticize you. Go to the person who's going to build you up, because you got to step into those big shoes. And this is something you take responsibility for, what you tell yourself and who you seek out when you need someone to tell you something that's going to keep you going. Kind of a beautiful thing that Jeff Lawton said is that all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. And I think that gardens are little microcosms of the world, and we figure out how to resolve all the conflicts that happen, and we manage the resources in and out of the garden. We're going to have templates, hundreds of creative templates of how to solve these global problems, and we just need to elevate those solutions at that point. And that's exactly what we're doing with this program. Y'all are engaging your creative capacity on the ground in all kinds of different diverse situations, and we're going to elevate that model to the level of the state, 40 million people, and say, we can do this. We can do this in every single situation that will come up because we know how to do it. We've come up with 10 solutions to how to solve that problem. It's not an unsolvable problem. You just need to put creativity in human minds and effort and desire on it. And that's what we're doing. In the course of this program, we are going to offer to every community what we're calling the Community Composting Hub Health Assessment. We're targeting it at like around month 6 and around month 18. And this is an opportunity to look really multidimensionally at like stuff that's happening as an impact of what you're doing. And that is compost health, which we've talked about, but also these and environmental health. But looking at these social dimensions too, of neighborhood and community health, organizational health, social systems health. We are not doing this to evaluate you or judge you. That's not what's happening. And that's what happens when we do assessments a lot. So I want you to take that idea and just chuck it out of the universe. This is really for reflection, for growth, for perspective building. This is an opportunity for y'all to contribute your unique ideas of the impact you're having to this, so that like certain areas that we might not have been aware that we could do work in through the work we're doing, someone else might be doing. And when we do this assessment, it's like, oh, I could easily integrate in that other dimension to what we're doing. That's what this is about. Harnessing our collective capacity to do like more dynamic and deeper work. And so this is just an invitation into that practice. And we're really wanting to invite the participation of everyone here as we go through this. If you think, hey, you're really not asking about this and you should, hit us up. Let's put it in there. Like, let's let everybody in this group reflect on that insight that you have. So this is not a static document. Please give feedback as we go through it, and we'll try to integrate that in. In order to build community, we need to build trust. And by building trust, we really center certain values in order to do that. And these values are values that are other-oriented, they're self-transcendent. The things that unify are things like social justice, like health, like sustainability, like living in a world of beauty. When people say you shouldn't talk to people from a values frame, we always talk from a values frame. We want to be mindful of, are we furthering the values that need to be furthered? Or are we furthering the values that are values of threat that dominate our society? So when you are doing work in these areas, say it. Call people into those values. So this is the last part of the presentation. So how do we build trust? Well, we engage in day-to-day practices that are intended to create cultures of trust. I'm going to share a couple frameworks that I find really powerful and a couple tools. These are some frameworks that I find to be helpful. So kind of moving from an anti-oppression framework, really recognizing the mechanisms by which people move into like supremacy thinking or like toxic identity politics, and really understanding how we can dismantle like the root mechanism that's there, that we see manifested a lot of places. The Block Build Be framework comes from Buddhist social justice tradition and core nonviolent commitments. When we're talking about anti-oppression, I think that Audre Lorde's quote that's often really just stripped down to like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, but it's actually presented in this concept of like kind of understanding different perspectives. She was, of course, talking in the tradition, like in a feminist tradition. So she offered, kind of as a response, in that context to like white feminists, she says, those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. And the reason why I bring up this whole quote, there's two things that get cut out when we just like kind of pull out that core line, which is really important. If we're trying to dismantle oppression, like we can't be using oppression to dismantle oppression. It's not going to work. We won't get it out that way. That's kind of the core that's there. But the dynamic difference, the conflicts that we have within our own groups that kind of pull us into that space of maybe wanting to engage in like an oppressive trend that we've been trained in. Those are the moments to recognize the skill and the difference as a strength of the community, that those varying perspectives, when we learn how to integrate them, like we will have figured out how to do it without oppression. And so those differences are really the opportunities to cultivate this strength of anti-oppression. When we use those tools, we may get a certain law on the books, or we may, win. We may get some money for this or something like that. But what I think the invitation here is to really look at those systems and look at how we can exist outside those systems. So if we look at monetary systems, for example, as ones that sometimes lead to our oppression, are we able to do things without those systems? And can we elevate systems that don't rely on the mechanisms that have been so long used to historically oppress? And so that's kind of an invitation to like really move into the creative space when we're doing this movement building work, whether it's dismantling work or whether it's building work. The Buddhist Peace Fellowship really puts forward the idea of block build B. I kind of mentioned this in the opening. This, from the first time I heard it, was like, yes, finally something that's really like kind of integrating these concepts of like, yes, we want to be really clear about when we're saying no and how we resist harm and injustice. Like we want to be upfront about that, but we can't stop there. We also need to build the new relationships, the new communities, the new structures that allow us to move forward, and the skills to kind of be our deepest, truest self, like through that process. Last, I think nonviolence is a really powerful organizing principle. Some people may come across nonviolence and feel like it's a way of just like communicating or acting that's maybe not effective. But I think when we're working to really dismantle oppression, it's a very powerful tool, and it's one that also is needed for strong movement building. So I want to introduce Binky Cashton's core nonviolent commitments. This is a framework that's really based on what she identifies as the pillars of nonviolence, which are courage, truth, and love. I feel like very resonant with that, and I think those are values that a lot of people are able to be resonant with. It's kind of a comprehensive document. She puts forward 34 points about relating to yourself, orienting towards others, interacting with others, relating to life, and engaging the world. In a very comprehensive way that invites deep reflection and encourages us to not only take responsibility for our part, but seek the support that we need in order to grow in these kind of complex manifestations of nonviolence that have to do with social structures, that have to do with systems change, that has to do with how we're interacting with one another, about the violence we enact upon ourselves. These are really, really powerful because they're really, really helpful in supporting the long-term well-being of your community and creating safe spaces to traverse difficulty and stay in community, to keep that community of trust rather than cultures of shame and blame and exclusion, which are sort of what happen when you don't invest the energy in these types of methodologies for retaining trust.